Good afternoon. I'm Rajiv from Fixo, and I'm delighted that you can join us today for our masterclass on digitising property businesses at scale. I'm just going to wait a few moments as the room starts to fill, and then we've got a really interesting, and I'm going to describe it as an action-packed agenda with two sector specialists who are going to guide us through, navigate us through the challenges of digital transformation, and most importantly for those of you on today's webinar, how best to execute and to avoid pitfalls or minefields or whatever you want to call it that they've seen through their careers. It looks like people are now coming into the room, and we'll go through the usual process. For those of you who have been on our webinars previously, this will be very familiar. If you haven't, then please do pay attention to the outset. And also be aware that all of the webinars in this series are available from our website for you to review. If you think this is interesting, you may want to similar types of content. So the first thing to note is that the audience is muted by default, but we do want to hear from you. So by default, you'll on the top right corner of your screen see a navigation menu, and you're very welcome to ask questions. So as we go through this, I think there's a huge amount that we're going to cover. So if anything warrants further discussion, is unclear, or there are just general themes that you would like us to pick up on, please do ask them. And my colleague Remy, who's on the line, will be consolidating questions for our esteemed panelists. And the usual disclaimer, so this is for general information purposes only. It shouldn't be taken as legal advice or official guidance. Although, if appropriate, I'm sure that James, who is one of our esteemed panelists, and his consultancy, Campbell Tickell, would be very happy to speak with you. And on to our guests. So today we are joined by Nigel Scowfield, a non-executive director of Armour, who has had an illustrious career in the property sector, and James Tickell, who is a partner at Campbell Tickell and has had an equally illustrious career, both. And in fact, I'm going to hand over to him right now so he can introduce himself. And I think what would be great to sort of set the scene around this, and it's really important to understand, is what philosophy do you take to digital transformation, and how would you be looking at the subject? So James, over to you.
Thank you, Rajiv, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. So I work for Campbell Tickell, and about half of our clients are housing associations, large and small. You may think of them as charities or social enterprises, but of course they are large property businesses too, and development and asset management are a part of their business. Some of them have 50,000 homes, one or two have more than 100,000. Of course, in Germany, there's one with 400,000 who think it would be nice to reach 1 million, but that's a different story. So these organizations are thinking a lot about digitization and about transformation. And indeed, several of them have had a considerable number of transformation programs over the years. And we now talk about transformation fatigue in some organizations. However, the pandemic has forced a transformation upon all of us. Home working is the norm, so we have Zoom fatigue now, as well as transformation fatigue. And actually, it's worked better than people thought. And it's re-energized people's appetite for real transformation. We've seen that it doesn't have to take 5 years to change things. You can actually do it in 5 days if you really want to. And I think we can also see that there's a vision of what a digitized property business might look like. We can see more clearly how that might be. Now, I don't have long, so I've just got 10 points to kick off with about my philosophy. And the first one is that there is no such thing as digital transformation. There is only transformation. IT systems are the means to the end. If transformation is driven by what systems can and can't do, it won't meet the needs of the business. So transformation is about leadership. If you're a weak leader, you can hide behind transformation for a bit, but you'll get found out. You can outsource aspects of transformation, but you can't outsource leadership. Number 3, if you digitize what you're doing now, you're setting in stone the old way of doing things in new clothes, and that won't do. Number 4, speaking as a consultant, don't trust consultants, especially those who have an idea of what they've done before, and they want you to do it their way, and they want you to pay for it. Remember that customers and frontline staff actually know best. As long as you ask the right questions and listen to the answers. So you do have to remember Henry Ford's famous joke about, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would want a faster horse. You have to bear that in mind. A few more points. Legacy IT systems are the work of Satan, and the death rattle of when you upload data from the old system to a new one, it's how you lose data. And speaking of data, Excel spreadsheets are the enemy of data integrity. Another one, integrating your systems with those of suppliers and contractors hardly ever works as well as it should. Updates are a moment of stress. They say you can't communicate too much, which is true. However, people will judge you on what you do, not on what you say you're going to do. And it's worth remembering that. So finally, it's all about data integrity. It is the touchstone for success, but it is the Achilles heel of so many organizations. Show me a large organization formed by a series of mergers, I will show you data integrity problems. So don't bother with expensive transformation schemes until you've got good data integrity. Make it a top priority, invest in it. It is the philosopher's stone of transformation. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. I'd like to hand over now to our other panelist, Nigel. Nigel, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience and outline your philosophy around digitisation and digital transformation, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Raj. And I agree with most of what James has just talked about from a first-hand point of view too. So why me? Why am I speaking to you for 45 minutes? Well, I've had 20 years in senior management across a number of different sectors, retail, banking, and most recently property management. I've had 10 years as a managing director of some of those businesses, the last 5 years in First Port Property Management, managing over 200,000 homes. I've seen lots of transformations over those years, witnessed millions of pounds being spent. I've seen really effective projects, and they tended to be about people-centric issues and people-centric solutions, whether it's customers or whether it's frontline or whether it's just people within the organization. I've also seen a huge amount of technology-led initiatives, and generally speaking, they were very expensive. They generally overran, and they generally, after the event, underwhelmed exactly what needed to be done. So be wary of technology-only solutions. And I think we get hung up on digital being technology. Digital is partly technology, but it's other things as well. I'm acknowledged as being the guy that puts the customer into the exec, into the boardroom, to be really clear about what it is we're trying to do. And I'm infuriatingly constantly asking the question, why? Why are we doing this? Why do we think this might work? And if you've asked why 5 or 6 times generally in a conversation, you get to the heart of it. And for the CFOs that might be on the call at the moment, that's probably something to do with saving some money. And if only the reason to do a transformation is to save money, then I suspect there might be some issues down the track. I agree completely with James. I think there are 5 aspects to a good transformation program. And the first one I've already mentioned, which is about being people-centric. Don't ever forget your people. And James has just talked about it in the context of leadership, and that's absolutely critical. Second, be clear on what the processes are you're looking to change and what they're going to end up being. There's obviously a technology bit, and we'll all talk about that for the next hour or so, whether it's on this call or otherwise. And I completely agree with James. Data is critical. And there's a 5th element, which is about measurement and making sure that what it is you're doing is well measured, well disciplined. It's got clear milestones, and you can celebrate against those milestones. So they will be the 5 streams of activity in any program you're likely to do, big or small. However, and James has touched on this, COVID has allowed us some time to think. It certainly allowed me personally more time to think than ordinarily. And I think COVID forced change on all of us, and that was different. Technology has actually helped us to connect through, particularly the early stages of COVID. It was all about Teams or Zoom or WebEx or whatever it might be. I think it's moved on from that, which is good. The other thing I've noticed in COVID is that we've created a lot of heroes. There's a lot of conversation about people that have gone the extra mile. And I do believe it's reduced the silos within businesses, and it's certainly reduced blame because people were preoccupied on other things too. So, over the last few months, I've been very proud of Armour's activity. Bit of a plug for being an exec director of Armour. They've got a new network called the Network Membership category, and that's about supporting and helping property managers. And I think what we've seen is emotional intelligence has been valued much higher through COVID. An example of that has been, the mental well-being has been prioritised in a lot of organisations to make sure that people working from home were doing it well and safely. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you both very much. So the philosophical introduction is hugely valuable because I think it's going to frame everything that comes thereafter. And so today we're going to take you through the life cycle of a digital transformation. I think the experts will show how it's not, there is no end point, but it's a sort of infinite loop of improvement and perhaps re-evaluation. But to start off, we're going to start right at the beginning with the preparatory work. And I'd like to pose a question to both panelists, starting with Nigel. So Nigel, in terms of preparation, how do you decide on the right destination or objective to ensure that you're at least trying to get to the right place?
Yeah, obviously, before you even begin the journey, you need to know where you're going. And I always have a very simple philosophy, which is understand the customer's needs. I think we get quite muddled sometimes with customers' needs, and we confuse them with customers' wants. An example of that would be lifts. In most of the blocks that we manage, the needs are that when you're living on the 7th floor, when you press the button for the lift's going to work. That's the need. What we sometimes interpret in property management is the want, and that's the want is when the lift breaks down, we'll get it fixed really quickly. And if you're going into a program that only replicates lifts breaking down and you can get them fixed a bit quicker, that's not what the customer needs at all. So be proactive about what activity you've got with the lead. So be clear on customers' needs. Also understand the customer journey. I don't think it's very complicated in the businesses that we are part of. Customers move into a property, then they live their life and everything's kind of going okay, or they have the normal issues about living their life. And then the third step on the journey is they've got a problem. The fourth step of the journey is they move out. And you might not have any control over they move out, but we put all of our effort, or a significant amount of our effort, into when things go wrong. And I wonder if we had displaced that amount of effort into when things were not going wrong, and we created advocacy throughout the process, that we might end up with a slightly better place. The other thing I would say very clearly is be clear why you're doing it. We often understand what we're doing and we understand how we're doing it. And I think from a leadership point of view, we often forget why we do these things. And that's the conversation for the organization to be aware of. Make the lead transformation people-centric. I have an acronym for people-centric programs. It's really simple. It's BEST. So build trust internally and externally. Easy, make it intuitive for everybody to use, because otherwise they will go back to doing it the way they were doing it. Safety needs to be at the heart of everything that we do when dealing with people's homes. They don't want to see safety, they just want to be safe. So build that into the program. And then talk about the opportunities and the expectations of what people's needs are and how they're going to get through it. So I would strongly advocate, BEST, build, easy, safety, talk. Also be very aware of your stakeholders. Often I've seen projects that are focused on customers or the front end or colleagues or whatever it might be, without the consideration of clients or investors or contractors. And contractors are often your best friend through these programs. The communities that sit around the buildings that we are responsible for are really important, because that's the homes and people's lives and their lifestyles. Governance is really important, and making sure that you understand what's required from a governance point of view. And we all face into regulators, some of it from a new point of view for the residential property managers, And from the housing association's perspective, we've been looking at regulation and regulators for some time. So just be really mindful that you have a plan to cover all of your stakeholders.
Excellent. Thank you, Nigel. And James, a really thorny question for you, which is, in terms of preparatory work, how do people get it wrong?
Well, I suppose I'm a world expert on how people get things wrong, because a lot of our work is spent putting things right when things have gone wrong. And I've alluded to some of them in my introductory remarks. I'm just going to focus on one that I didn't mention. And it kind of comes back to my own worst ever mistake in a professional role, which I will confess to now for the first time in public. And my mistake was a failure to cancel a computer program that looked like it wasn't going to work. I was persuaded by my advisors and IT people that we put so much money into it. I was a chief executive somewhere that shall remain nameless. And I was persuaded that we had to hang on in there and see it through and grit our teeth. And if I had followed my instinct and cancelled it, then a lot of money would have been saved. So I think that the way people get things wrong is they don't adjust their ideas once things have started to go a little bit off track. One housing association had a major transformation project called Project Jerusalem. And of course, that's a little bit of a clue as to the way that the leaders were approaching it. And one of the things they said is failure is unthinkable. So they pressed on. And the project failed, and it cost a very great amount of money. And in fact, the housing association concerned no longer exists, largely as a result of that activity. So I do think that in this game that we're talking about, leaders have to be ready to realize when things are not going well and either pull the plug, no more good money after bad, or at least make a major change of direction. They have to be ready to do that. It's not actually a mark of failure to admit that an experiment hasn't worked. It's how you learn about how things do work. So I think that's my big one here. It's the failure of leadership teams, the way they talk themselves into a mindset that we put so much into this, we have to see it through, it cannot fail, and then it does fail. So that's my big one, I think, Rajiv.
Excellent, thank you. And I'd say from some projects that I've seen in my time in the sector, sometimes the identity of the decision makers or the project leaders becomes intertwined with the projects themselves, and they see the project's change of direction as a personal failure rather than being able to separate the two. And I think that probably leads very neatly onto our next topic, which is resourcing the project. So Nigel, we've heard about a need to change direction, to reassess and perhaps to change. But when you start, how do you make the decision about whether to buy, build or partner to deliver the transformation project?
I think it's four things. Budget, how much have you got to spend? How much can you afford to spend? What are you investing in? The second element is about skill set, knowledge within your team, experience. It's interesting. I was on a webinar earlier this week. Deloitte have done a survey with 1,400 companies, asking the question around the capacity of the board and the capacity of the executives to understand technology. 75% of the respondees said they didn't think that there was enough tech savvy knowledge and skills within either the executive team or the board. Now, what that suggests to me is there's a skills gap, and therefore working hard before you begin your journey to understand that your team is with you is really important. Time is another aspect of resourcing. How urgent is it that you want the changes to be embedded and to be recognized by the customer or by the company? And then the fourth element, which isn't one that I hear too much about, which is the USP. So what is it you're trying to change to? What the change is going to be noticeable within the market that you operate in and the customer's expectation of it. So what is it you're wanting to achieve? Because I wonder, and James talked it through earlier, are you changing for the sake of change, and are you just changing the way that you do things in a way that the customers are not going to notice? There are three chunks of projects in my mind. One is about reactive stuff, one is about proactive, and then the other is about building relationships. And I would say, to answer your question about how do you choose to partner, how do you choose to move forward, the reactive stuff, you know, something's gone wrong, customers telling you that the lift's not working, or there's a leak, or there's some antisocial behavior. You need a contractor to go and solve a problem. You might need to manage the workflow of that program, and you need to evidence it's been completed. My goodness, there's some really good examples in the marketplace that do all of that, and they do it in a box, and you can go and buy the box rather than spend huge amounts of time making it your own language. And you know, Fixflow is a great example of how they resolve those problems. The proactive stuff is really important, because that's what you really need to be focusing on from a compliance point of view, your asset management, major works, governance, etc. But the really important stuff is the relationships, because if you can embed all the processes, then that leaves your teams free to build really effective relationships with customers, with contractors, with developers. And I think that's probably the holy grail. So I think be clear what it is you're trying to do, and then look for solutions in the marketplace that are there and really good.
Good. Thank you, Nigel. And James, you introduced your response to my question before as you're the man who's called when things go wrong. So we're on resourcing. How have you seen resourcing go wrong? And I guess probably more important to the audience, what could have been done differently to deliver a successful outcome?
Yeah, I should say that I do work with organisations where everything is going fine as well, Rajiv. I'm not only the Grim Reaper when there are problems. But I have seen a number of organisations that have wasted large sums of money on technology and transformation that didn't work. And I think one of the common themes is that of the one that I alluded to in my introductory remarks, of kind of outsourcing the thinking to perhaps a large consultancy that has a particular model that's going to cost you £3 million, and it worked fine for a health authority and a local authority and an electricity utility, so why shouldn't it work for a property business? And sign on the dotted line here. The clever senior people show up at the beginning, and then suddenly you've got a whole load of teenagers wandering around with clipboards for months, wasting everybody's time. And blow me down, you know, the bill comes in and nothing much has changed. So I think that those kinds of mistakes are essentially around inadequate preparation. It's about people not thinking deeply enough about the new operating model they want to achieve with their transformation. They're seduced by the technology, they're seduced by the exciting talk of transformation and, you know, new paradigms and stuff that people like Nigel and myself are so good at doing, aren't we, Nigel? And they just get carried away with the momentum of the project. They sign the check, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really work. They haven't thought through what they want. They haven't prepared enough. They haven't spoken to the frontline staff. They haven't. You know, I'm no particular enthusiast of particular models, but the kind of lean thinking philosophy of looking at your processes, working out where the waste is before you start putting them into a new digital form. You know, all of that preparation is important. So it may be that the easiest thing to say is that they should have taken an extra 6 months before they got going. They should have thought about it more, maybe 12 months, maybe 6 months, something like that. A process. We'll talk a little bit about ownership and communication, but I think it's, you know, I've alluded to kind of groupthink already. I think this one is about being in too much of a hurry, about not thinking about where you want to get to.
Thanks, James. So in terms of our business, we take the approach that the truth isn't in our heads, the truth is in our customers' heads, and customers includes employees and people we work with, because they all sort of interact with what we do. So let's step it forward then. So this is a wonderful abbreviated journey through a transformation project. So we're clear on what we're trying to achieve. We've taken sufficient time and we haven't rushed the process. We've got appropriate alignment, and we've decided which bits are core to what we do, which bits are readily available in the market, and how we're going to put it together. We're now into project delivery. So, Nigel, how do you ensure that a project achieves the objectives that were set out at the preparatory stage? So how do you stay on track?
Two things. I think good governance and a very clear communication plan. By good governance, I mean the chief exec leading a change board understanding. So weekly change program board meetings to understand the progress or failures that have been achieved in the last week. So very immediate, very hands-on. Weekly dashboards to understand how you're managing against progress and risks. Risks and spends being monitored on a weekly basis, and some of these projects might take a year, but the critical aspects are almost on a weekly basis in terms of spend and progress. Make sure the program's transparent, so don't hide things, don't have a second agenda. Ensure that the interdependencies are understood. So most programs are very complex and there's lots of teams involved in those programs. Make sure that the workload is flowing through the interdependencies, otherwise there'll be blockages. And when you do get blockages, remove them. That's the idea of the change board, that they can take action. Success needs to be celebrated, and not just success, but failures too. Because failures are a great way of understanding where the edges of things are. So, make sure that, the big programs that talk about success only, I'm very confident that they don't get the best from the people, because people fail all the time. And I think there's an opportunity from a leadership point of view to talk about failure in a positive way and welcome it and understand it. Communications plan is really important. Weekly communications to those involved, monthly communications to the wider audience. Ensure that you've got change champions within your organization at all levels and within all the teams to make sure that you're not missing things within the business. Subject matter experts, sometimes these are individuals that are really busy and they need to be taken out of their normal job to give them the time and the capacity to be able to do what's needed. Remember that you're creating a new way of working, not just a digital transformation. So talk about the new way of working in a context that everybody can identify with and understand what their part is in the new way of working. Storytelling is a great way of making it easy for people to understand change. So be competent at storytelling. Not everyone's great at telling stories. So, encourage your people, train your people to be able to tell stories. That will make a massive change going forward. And then remember the stakeholders. They need dialogue. Agree the dialogue you're going to have with them and make sure that you deliver the dialogue through the process. So good governance and a communication plan.
So thank you, Nigel. And James, when you made your introductory remarks and talked about your philosophy, you talked about the fact that people cannot outsource their leadership. So in the project delivery phase, how do you ensure the right people own the project all the way to completion and make sure that the project team itself remains aligned? Do you have any thoughts you'd like to share around that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the mistakes people make is that they buy in skills from outside. And what they should be doing is seconding their best people across to the project and getting other people to fill in on the business as usual. So I think one strong piece of advice I would give is, release people from their daily duties, a day a week, 3 days a week, full time, whatever it is, get them across working on the project and let somebody act up beneath them or get in agency staff or whatever, so that you've got your best people working on this with their undivided attention rather than as a kind of an add-on. And I think that can work hugely well. And funnily enough, it works pretty well at the governance level too. So one large organization I worked with that was doing digital transformation actually set up a subcommittee of the board to oversee this. And I think that was good because actually this is board level stuff. It's about the mission, it's about the operating model, it's about what the organization is there to do. And they had people, they co-opted people onto that project board for a year or so while it was going through. They were paid for their contribution, they were experts in the field, and they were able to challenge. They'd seen it before. They knew how these things go wrong. So, you know, it was very sensible of that board to beef up its governance role with some extra skills for the duration as well. So I think there's a number of things that you can do. I think the other thing to do is to make sure that you involve people who it may not be obvious that they have a role. You know, the frontline staff, the middle managers, the people who have contact with customers, have an advisory board or have advisory panels or whatever, as well as your actual project board. You know, get people meeting from time to time, talking about what's going on, sharing their reactions. You know, they've been on a training session. You know, how did it work for you? You know, let's get some feedback. So I think all of that careful design of the process and getting in the right skills, that all contributes to success.
Thanks, James. And I love the idea of seconding your best people onto a digital transformation project, but actually any core change the business project, you want your very best people on there, and the ability then to disseminate information and understand who the stakeholders are is hugely valuable. So I wish I'd known that earlier in my career, but thank you for sharing that. And Nigel, you said celebrate your successes, celebrate your failures, share your failures. So how do you ensure that the structure of the business allows people to share, to have permission to fail, and to sort of ensure that everybody learns from those failures?
Well, the critical thing is it's led from the top. So if the chief executive of the business and the exec team are able to talk about their failures and their observations of failures, then that makes a huge difference. I think, you know, for me, ownership that starts from the top. Be honest, celebrate those failures. We all do things wrong, and just accept it. It's life. Tell stories about those learning points, as I said earlier. Share ideas openly. So First Port use Yammer, and I'm sure a lot of people on this call use a social media site of some description internally. And Yammer was a fantastic way of people asking for help. So don't ignore social media, and don't ignore the people that might need some support. I think the other big thing, I mentioned silos earlier, and you know, people work within teams really well, and then they blame other teams for letting them down rather than individuals because it's politer. I think that needs to be challenged. I think, you know, what you want at the end of the transformation is no silos, and people really understanding how they can work together. There's all sorts of complicated language around it about matrix management, but actually it's about people understanding their role and how they follow it through. And then use change champions. You know, people talking about these things makes a big difference. The other aspect of making sure people understand that they can fail is, I call it about a red thread. Make sure there's something weaved into the communications at all points. So heroes are acknowledged for doing things right and for doing things wrong, and tell the whole story. Break those barriers down. Remember that new way of working. It needs to be fed in, you know, consistently for people to understand it is a new way of working. And most importantly, take time to listen, to understand how people are feeling, and make time to understand how things are progressing or not.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And that might be the red thread. I've not heard that phrase before, but it's something we should do. And so, James, at the outset, you said, I think you used the phrase, was it transformation fatigue? So for organisations that have been through a transformation project on various occasions in various guises. So how do you convince people it's different this time? How do you get them to pay attention?
Yes. Somebody said to me in one organisation that shall again remain nameless, we've been transformed 3 times and it's still pretty much the same. And I've heard of variations on that theme. So it's not only transformation fatigue, it's actually kind of initiative cynicism. People have seen any number of initiatives come and go, and things have stayed more or less the same. So at the end of the day, the only way you can convince people it's different is by making it different. That is what they will believe. Now, we've seen organizations that have revolutionized their services to tenants after periods of failure. And I think the rule of thumb is it takes about 6 months for the perception to catch up with the reality. So if you say to people, you know, is your landlord any better than it was? You know, obviously you don't put it quite like that. they will generally say, no, it's just as bad as it always was for about 6 months. And then they'll start to say, well, actually, do you know what? They did actually answer the phone last time I rang, and somebody did show up at the time they said. So it takes a while to come through. I think what Nigel's phrase about telling stories is important. I think owning the narrative, making sure that it's not about you trumpeting, your own propaganda. And of course, one of the real dangers is believing your own propaganda. It's about having other people who are out there, the tenant representatives, the leaders in the community, saying, hold on a minute, actually, do you know what? It is different. It is getting better. So nothing communicates better than actual results and actual change. Things, repairs being done more quickly, operatives being better at showing up on time, getting the first fix right consistently, all of that. It takes a while to get through, but actually that is how you communicate. It is what you have done, not what you are going to do, because nobody cares what you're going to do until you've done it.
Absolutely. And just my take on this is, for organisations that have previously transformed but everything is still the same, please don't feel that the next time it will remain the same. I think hopefully through the framework that we're talking through today, or in fact by reaching out to the speakers we have, things will be different, and successful transformation, as evidenced by outcomes rather than what you say, will be achieved. And I'm going to come on to what I describe as an awkward or an underserved topic here. So we've gone through the projects, we've planned it, we've resourced it, people have stayed aligned, we've failed, we've learned, and we've delivered. Now, the thorny question that I don't think people really grapple with, or even possibly address even at the end, is for Nigel. So how do you ensure that the structure of the business that has been transformed is now appropriate for the business? So change has happened. What do you do in terms of your structure?
So I think you're clear through the program what you're trying to do with structure, and I think a number of things happen in a transformation, don't they? So there's a shared journey. So you've gone through something together, either as a team or as individuals. So you've got an experience that's unique. It's new. You've formed new habits to follow through the transformation. And you've probably got a few battle scars, actually, and you'll have celebrated a few victories along the journey. So be really mindful of that. The downside of that is that you've stretched this elastic band, and we all know what happens when you stretch an elastic band and let go of it. It goes back pretty much to what it was before, and that's what I think a number of people suffer from. So those new habits that have been formed can very quickly go back to the old way of doing things. So you need to put some markers down to make sure that stays different. Interestingly, battle scars get remembered more so than the victories. So celebrate those victories a little bit more. So I think have a planned review would be my answer to your question. Make sure that you're constantly reviewing the people in your business from their skills perspective, and it's okay to not have those skills and get them trained. Fill the gaps. Make sure that you've got some technical expertise in the relationships that you build. The CEO is critical still all the way through this process, and also the executive team. Hold stakeholder events, find out how people are feeling. Talk to your customers and your colleagues all the time about the changes. Make sure you take time to listen and understand. And my final comment would be, there is a big agenda out in our marketplace that I don't know that everyone's got to. And I'm talking about the environmental, social and government, corporate governance, the ESG agenda. Next year in Glasgow is the summit for net zero. And Mark Carney is leading the challenge on how we are reducing our carbon footprint within organizations. I was on a call yesterday and we were talking about the EWS1 activities around changing the external wall systems of buildings, and they're not considering how you're improving the carbon footprint of those buildings. The same will be said for, if you get it right first time in your digital transformation, you should be able to evidence that you're reducing your carbon footprint. But if at the beginning of the program you don't consider your carbon footprint, it's very difficult retrospectively to be able to say what it is you've achieved. So really be clear on the big agenda of what's happening in the world, and also be mindful of inclusion in its totality. What is it you're trying to achieve out of the bigger agenda going forward?
Thanks, Nigel. I've actually got a couple of questions for James on this. One ties back to your earlier points about pulling the best people out from across the business. Just a very good question. So you've now got your crack commando team of business change and transformation. Do you hold them permanently and have them deployed to the next business projects you have, or do you release them back in? And then secondly, we spoke previously, and I thought it was really interesting the way you described the transformation cycle. I was wondering if you could share something about that with the audience, particularly in respect of continuous improvement.
Yes. Well, I think it's a good question about what happens to the people who've been seconded across. Of course, the answer, I think, is that they won't go back to their old jobs because their old jobs won't exist anymore. They will be going back to new jobs because they have transformed the way things work. So I think that, yes, they will need to go back and have a kind of daily job that isn't about a specific initiative, but it will be a different job because actually, if it's been done well, every job in the organization will be different. It will feel different. It'll have a different purpose. There'll be different colleagues and so on. So I think that's my answer on that. That reminds me that it's important not to think of transformation as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, we have been talking about it that way because obviously there are phases and they necessarily work like that. But we live now at this time of extraordinary change. There are a great number of things going on: the pandemic, zero carbon, focus on diversity and inclusion, focus on communities, and so on. And actually, all of our businesses are going to be transforming themselves non-stop. Transformation is actually daily business, and it doesn't stop. There isn't a moment when you've finished it, because actually you have to go on. And that kind of leads on to my next point about the transformation cycle. So if you look at the history of organizations, they generally have kind of peaks and troughs. There's a period when things are getting better, there's new leadership, there are new systems, projects are successful, and then the organization peaks. And then, if you're not careful, it begins to deteriorate. Things begin to go downhill, the culture of the organization unravels, there are setbacks, and then it reaches a low point. And then somebody has to grab it and push it up to the next high point. And the trick of success is, when things are at their peak, not to let them deteriorate further, but to actually grab them and push them to the next peak. And there's a whole philosophy around that called the sigmoid curve, and there isn't time to go into it, but people are welcome to look up the sigmoid curve theory of change. But it is really about, when you have had a big push on change, a big initiative, if you rest on your laurels, things will start to go downhill. You have to grab it and push it for the next big change. And I do think that the pandemic has been terrible. People have died, many people have lost their jobs, and so on. But nonetheless, there has been learning from it, and there are opportunities. And people do say occasionally, never waste a good crisis. And I think for many organizations, this is the moment to really grab hold of the transformation cycle, take the learning from the pandemic and from their previous activities, and actually push, this time, the real transformation that we've been talking about. I think there's a real opportunity to do that, which is why it's once in a generation. And as they say, fortune favors the bold.
Thank you very much. And just checking on time. So I am hugely grateful to all of you for attending today's webinar, whether live or through the recording that will be disseminated, and to Nigel and James for giving up their time and sharing their expertise with us. You'll get their contact details as part of the follow-up email. If there are any topics or areas that you would like us to explore through this series, please do email us at research@fixlow.com. And just to signpost you to the next webinar in our series, which I think will be relevant to most of the audience. So Post-Hackett, Building a Safer Future. My colleague Joe Goss will be talking that through with some sector experts, both from the social housing sector and from residential block management, next Wednesday. So you'll get a registration link as usual. If you can't attend live, a recording will be sent to you if you opt into that. And all it remains for me to do is say thank you again to our panelists, to the masters of the mastermind, and to the audience. And I hope you all stay safe and well. Goodbye.